Joining me now is Daily Signal executive editor Rob Bluey. Rob, couldn't some of these children actually be the very same children these horrific criminal deportees have been abusing?
That's right, Jake, and good morning to you. This is a story that I think deserves more attention, the fact that you have resistance along the lines of governors, mayors who are blocking immigration and customs enforcement from carrying out the law and deporting these individuals. Not only could they be children who, were smuggled into this country illegally, but they have been sex trafficked and abused over the course of the last 4 years. We know this because Tom Homan and others who used to work during the first Trump administration have told us that this is what the cartels do. These are not good people. These are people who are taking advantage of young kids. And any governor who is there trying to protect these violent criminals, I think, deserves not only to be held accountable by the voters, but also I hope that our federal government can step in and maybe shake them free and get them some common sense that this is what they need to do.
Yeah, and it's really incumbent upon us to let the American people know what's going on here. If you really care about these children, you've got to deport these criminal illegal migrants. Children are almost, I would say, drugs first, children second, child trafficking second, their biggest crime. All right, Rob, the Trump administration is not as worried about bad publicity this time and pressure from the news media, and probably because the news media, the establishment news media, is much wounded and diminished. And I think that that is playing a role in the lack of fear over issuing potential bans on trans people in the military. I also think maybe the White House feels emboldened by the polls that show the actual American people will support these policies. I mean, trans people in the military, we know this is an issue for morale, but forget about that. Let's say that that isn't a problem. The cost, Rob, to put these people into the military and to pay for their surgeries, and by the way, even if the surgeries are 100% successful, the complications afterwards are lifetime and very, very expensive. I'm going to guess that something like 70% of the American people are in favor of this.
Well, Jake, we do know from polling that this is strongly opposed, taxpayer dollars being used for this purpose. If you go back to the end of last year, you had a situation where even Democrats voted in the House and the Senate to pass a legislation called the National Defense Authorization Act, which prohibited TRICARE from performing these types of surgeries on individuals under the age of 18. Now, there were some Republicans who wanted to make that, everyone, not just children. But I think that Donald Trump is not only responding to an issue that polled very well during his campaign for president, but again, going back to some of the things that Lloyd Austin did at the Department of Defense. You'll remember that there was a big blow up involving Senator Tommy Tuberville over an abortion memo. And so there were a number of cultural issues that Lloyd Austin inserted into the Defense Department. And I'll tell you what's happened. It's taken the focus of the military off of readiness and lethality, as Pete Hegseth has said, and it's politicized it. I mean, and it goes well beyond those two issues that we've just talked about. There's DEI and all sorts of other things that Austin implemented during his tenure. And so I am glad to see that Donald Trump is addressing this. I think that this is a long-term problem. The recruitment crisis that the military is facing right now will take years to fix and overcome. And there's all sorts of issues that Pete Hegseth is going to have to do in order to get the fighting forces back in a condition where they can protect our country.
Yeah, and again, a common sense point here. We don't have a universal draft in this country. We don't have a draft. Remember, this is a volunteer military. So if there's a policy in the military that you don't think really jives with your cultural background, with your sexual orientation, or with that, then don't join. You're not forced to do so. And we certainly shouldn't be forced to do so as a taxpayers to pay for it. All right, Rob, this seems like it's just like a Wall Street story, but it's not. National security folks are also seeming to get a little bit freaked out about the AI cost-effective breakthrough by the Chinese. The supposed, I have my doubts about this. I'm sure the Chinese are stealing our technology, but doing it for much cheaper, I'm not so sure. But a Chinese startup called DeepSeek freaked out the markets yesterday with their announcement that they can do AI stuff like we do for a lot cheaper. I'm just not buying it, but I can see why there's a freak out over this. What's your take on this? Should we be worried?
Jake, I'm not buying it either. I'm in the same position you are. I do believe the Chinese are probably stealing from the United States. There's well-documented evidence that is taking place. And so when it comes to AI, I'm sure that the same is true. Now, in this particular case, I do think that the markets probably overreacted yesterday, and I'm hopeful that there's going to be a correction today, because what's at stake here is we know that in the United States, these technology companies are spending billions of dollars, and China swoops in and says, oh, we can do this for a fraction of the cost. Well, what we don't know is how China got there. Of course, the Chinese Communist Party is not going to come clean. And as we were recently talking about in the case of TikTok, we know that there are nefarious actors in China who are using technology for devious purposes. And so I think in this particular case, AI is going to impact all of our lives in the future. So we need to make sure that we're doing everything right. But again, and I don't want to pin the blame at the Biden administration for everything, but I just have to wonder what was going on these last 4 years that was allowing China to do some of the things that they were able to do. And now here you have another problem that Donald Trump is going to have to address.
Yeah, well, but I will say this. We are overspending on AI. I've been saying this for 10 years, so all the AI big tech people. I'm a 54-year-old man who lives on Long Island. You don't need to spend billions of dollars on AI to figure out that you need to show me ads for Mets tickets and barbecue grills, all right? I can do it for a lot cheaper for that. That doesn't take a genius. All right, speaking of threats, though, and a serious threat, your own Daily Signal has an exclusive story that now someone else has it, but you guys had it first, about the Trump team bringing Israeli Iron Dome technology to the U.S. Hey, that makes sense to me, since the technology was jointly created by Israel and the U.S. But what jumps out at me is this is something that I think may have already been in place, but just hasn't been announced. So this sounds to me like an expansion, a smart one. What else jumps out at you at this story that was in your own publication, Daily Signal?
Yes, well, this was one of several things that Pete Hegseth was able to announce on day one at the Pentagon. What stands out to me is, number one, it's finally fulfilling the promise that Ronald Reagan made to the American people back in the 1980s, when this was obviously a threat with a different country, the Soviet Union at the time. Now, in this particular case, we know that North Korea and perhaps China in the future could have the capability to launch a missile that targets the United States. And in the case of North Korea, it takes 33 minutes. I mean, it's pretty quick in which they could, do significant damage to our country. And so having an Iron Dome and having missile defense in the United States, I think is critically important for the future. I'm glad to see that the United States is working with Israel on this, Jake, because Israel has demonstrated just recently that they can combat the missiles coming from Iran and other, bad actors in the Middle East. And so you have a situation where let's use the best technology that is available on the market and make sure that we're protecting the American people. I think it's a win-win, and I'm glad to see Donald Trump is once again fulfilling one of his campaign promises and bringing this to reality.
Yeah, there's another undercurrent to this story, though, that I think I'm sorry to have to bring up, but I think, you know that the rockets that are launched regularly into Israel from Gaza, these are small rocket launchers that can be set up almost anywhere. And I think this is also a result of what's going on at our southern border. You can just be a mile and maybe even less from the southern border and probably easily set up, I don't get any ideas, terrorists, and probably easily set up the kind of rocket launchers Israel has to deal with in Gaza. So there are a number of people who are saying, well, this is an Iron Dome system that deals with smaller types of rockets and smaller types of missiles and things like that. Sadly, I think that because of what's gone on the southern border the last 4 years, that is also one of the threats we're dealing with right now. Any thoughts on that? Last loss of 30 seconds.
Well, I mean, just yesterday I saw that there were news reports that the cartels were firing gunshots across the border into Texas. I mean, so yes, you're absolutely correct that they could pose a threat. I don't think it would be necessarily the Mexican government, but yes, bad actors in Mexico could potentially take advantage of this vulnerability.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry I just advertised that, but I'm sure they thought of it themselves anyway. All right, Rob Bluey, thank you so much for joining us. Have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, Jake.